Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great day or evening or whatever it may be in your part of the world. My name is Anna and I am a knitter and maker living in Seattle, Washington in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys all about yarn. So if you're a knitter or a crocheter or yarn user of any kind, this is meant to be a very educational and informative video for you. I'm going to be talking kind of about yarn, a lot of principles of yarn, and then a lot about yarn substitutions, because I know there are lots of beautiful patterns out in the world that are made with beautiful yarns that can kind of sometimes either be inaccessible because they're not sold in your part of the world or just because they're out of your price range. So my point in this video is just kind of talk you through the process of choosing a yarn for your next project so that you'll end up with a product that you're really happy with and that fits in your budget. So that's pretty much the point of today's video. Let's just get started. I would like to start by letting you know that a lot of the information that I'm giving to you, I learned from other knitters. And so this is a great way for me to kind of give back to the community. I've been knitting for a really long time, but didn't learn about a lot of these gauge and yarn weight things until like in the last few years. And it's definitely improved my knitting and made me feel happier with it made me feel much happier with the items that I'm knitting. So all that to say, I hope you enjoy this and I hope it's helpful for you in some way. Okay, so when you have a knitting pattern, and I'm going to use Ravelry as an example, and I'll put like a screen recording of my iPad so you can see what I'm talking about. But generally, kind of standard, knitting patterns come with a recommended yarn, or whatever yarn the designer has used to make the sample is the yarn that they're kind of basing the rest of the project around. So for the purpose of today's video, to kind of explain this all to you, I'm going to be basing what I talk about on the gingerbread pattern, which is a free pattern from SUBSTITUTIONS. They have really beautiful patterns. Most of them are free and very accessible. The first sweater I ever knit was an SUBSTITUTIONS pattern, so they're a great place to start. And just for the purpose of this video, we're going to be starting with the gingerbread sweater, just so I can talk you through the information that you're given when you're buying the pattern, and then since it's a free pattern, we can look at it together and just kind of talk through what that means. So the gingerbread sweater by SUBSTITUTIONS is a basic raglan sweater knit with a light fingering and a lace weight yarn held together. So it's held with a mohair-like lace weight yarn and a fingering weight yarn. That might not mean anything to you. So first, we're going to start by talking about yarn weights. There are different systems for classifying yarns, depending on where you live and where you're buying your yarn from, but generally there are like 6 yarn classifications that go by different names, but generally there are about 6. So you have lace weight yarn, fingering weight yarn, sport weight yarn, DK, worsted, and bulky weight yarn. 6 different kinds. And the way that I think about those yarns, generally when I'm classifying a yarn, or like generally the standard for these yarns, is defined by the length of yarn that you get in 100 grams or 3.5 ounces of yarn. I'm going to use the metric system for the purpose of this video because I find it a little easier to understand. But there are conversions and it's pretty easy to figure out what the differences are. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be talking about the meterage in a 100 gram skein of yarn for your reference. So standard lace weight yarn has between like 550, 600 meters and more per 100 grams. So when you're buying a lace weight yarn, the most common lace weight yarn that you'll get is a silk mohair or an alpaca silk kind of yarn like this. This is the Drops Kid Silk Mohair. It's a very standard lace weight yarn. And one strand is extremely fine. You can see here, that's one strand of a lace weight yarn. It's extremely fine. And the standard, this comes in 25 gram balls with about 212 meters per 100 grams. So that puts you at like 850 or 900 meters per 100 grams. That's a very fine yarn. That's a lace weight yarn. You can also gauge, or you can also understand yarn weights by looking at the wraps per inch. That's another measure I don't use super often, but the higher the wraps per inch, the finer the yarn. Same is true with weight. The more meterage per 100 grams, the finer the weight the yarn. So this is a lace weight yarn. A fingering weight yarn is slightly heavier than a lace weight yarn, and it's usually between like 375, 380 to like 500, 550 meters per 100 grams. These are not hard and fast like breaks. They're more like guiding buckets, but generally a fingering weight yarn, which I have a couple examples of here, is similar to holding 2 lace weight strands together. So this is a fingering weight yarn. This is a hand-dyed 100% merino. It's 450 meters per 100 grams. You can see if I compare this fingering weight yarn to this lace weight yarn, there's a significant difference in thickness. This is much finer than this. You can look at 2 fingering weight yarns held together. This is about 400 meters per 100 grams. And if I hold the 2 fingering weight strands next to each other, they're fairly similar. This one, the orange one, will be slightly finer than the pink one because the orange one has more meterage per 100 grams. They're also spun differently, which we'll get to in a minute, but these are both fingering weight yarns, 450, 400 meters per 100 grams. So the next one up is a sport weight yarn, which is not always standard, but generally I think of sport weight as between fingering and DK, because the way that I think about yarn is you have a lace weight, 2 lace weights is a fingering, 2 fingering is a DK, 2 DK is a worsted, 2 worsted is a bulky. That's kind of the way that I think about it. It's not a hard and fast rule. Most of this is not hard and fast rule, but they're guidelines to help you when you're trying to figure out what the heck you're doing. So a sport weight yarn is, like I said, between a fingering and a DK. So I would classify a sport weight yarn as anything that's like 300 meters per 100 grams to like 375-ish. This is a sport weight yarn. This has 368 yards, or about 340 meters per 100 grams. If I hold this next to the fingering weight yarn, you can see that the white yarn is slightly thicker than the orange yarn. Here's another example of a sport weight yarn. This is a 50-gram ball, and it has 175 meters, so that's about 350 meters for 100 grams. You can see those 2 are both sport. They're a similar amount of yardage, similar yarn weight. So that's a sport weight yarn. Next you have a DK, which is generally, it's called double knitting because it's generally 2 fingering weight yarns. A DK yarn is anywhere from like 220 to 300 meters per 100 grams. Obviously there's some room for fluctuation, but here are 2 examples. This is Barreau by Retrosaria Pomar, and this is a Mountain Colors hand-dyed yarn, but they both have 230 meters per 100 grams. And you can see they're quite similar in weight compared to the sport weight. So there's the DK and the sport held next to each other. Slightly similar, but there is a difference. There's also a difference in spin here, so that's something we'll get into. So that's a DK. That's like, I would say, one of the most common weights of yarn and one of the most versatile. Next up, you get a worsted weight yarn, which is generally between like 170, maybe even a little 100, like 160, up to like 220 or 230 meters per 100 grams. Here's 2 examples. This is Cascade 220 Superwash Effects, and this is Istex Let Lopi. This has 220 meters per 100 grams. This has 200 meters per 100 grams. Here's a comparison. They're both decently thick. You can see we're starting to get thicker here. This is the Lopi. These 2 yarns are similarly spun, so you can see, so here you can see the worsted weight is the gray and the DK weight is the purple. They're similar, but the DK is slightly finer. Then you get into bulky weight yarns, which I don't work with quite often because I don't love to work with them and I don't love finished products made with them. But bulky weight yarns are usually anything that's like 150 meters per 100 grams or fewer. So you can have like super bulky yarns that are like 80 meters per 100 grams. This example is a bulky roving yarn, which is 105 meters per 100 grams. So we're starting to get pretty chunky here. As you can see, this is the bulky compared to the worsted. There's a pretty big difference there. So those are your yarn weights. They're not hard and fast rules, but generally lace weight is the finest, bulky or super bulky yarn is the largest, and the rest of them kind of fall into place in between. So from finest to chunkiest, you get lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted. There's a wide variety in here. And there are lots of yarns to choose from within those categories. Even some of the examples that I showed you of the same yarn weight looked significantly different. So that's when you start getting into thinking about the spin of the yarn and the gauge that you're knitting at. So I think as far as the spin of the yarn goes, there are like 4 spins that are kind of the most important. And that's, when I talk about the spin of the yarn, I'm talking about how the yarn is constructed. So you can see with this sport weight yarn, if you look super closely, the yarn is multiple strands twisted together. They're plied together. Not sure this is the best one to show you. Here, let me show you on this one. So this is a sport weight 100% wool from Hillesvag. It is a 2-ply. So you can kind of see here, it will focus, you can see that there are 2 pieces of yarn that are spun together. And I'll go back to this one again. You can untwist those strands of yarn and see that there are multiple strings that are twisted together. I'll even unply them for you. There's multiple strings that are twisted together to give you your thickness of yarn. So this is a 3-ply, this is a 2-ply. So that's what a plied yarn is. And I would say for yarn, you go from like unspun to multiple plies. So an unspun yarn, which I'm sure you've heard about because people talk about it all the time, is a yarn that has no twist to it at all. This is some unspun yarn. There's no twist. It's just extruded from a machine. There's no twist. It doesn't hold together super strong and it kind of pulls apart. That's an unspun yarn. Then you get like a roving yarn like this. This yarn might look unspun. It's a single strand of wool, but it does have a gentle twist to it. So if you look at the yarn, you can see that it's kind of been twisted. So this is what is generally called a roving yarn because it's one strand of a single twist of yarn. So that's a 1-ply roving yarn. It's still spun, but it's not plied. Then you get into like a 2-ply yarn, which I showed you here, which is 2 pieces of yarn twisted together. Then you can have a 3-ply yarn, which is like this, which is 3 strands of yarn twisted together. Then you can get upwards of that. So this Cascade 220 is a 4-ply yarn. It's 4 strings of yarn twisted together. And you can have like up to like 12 or 14 plies. The purpose of a ply is to make your yarn stronger. The more strings you have that are twisted together, it gives the yarn more strength. It also can lend kind of a different look to the fabric. So a 2-ply yarn, because it's just 2 pieces of yarn twisted together, can be a little bit thinner, whereas like a 4-ply yarn has a little bit more air in there, so it's a little bit plumper. But generally, for the most part, the yarn like constructions that you need to think about are an unspun, which I showed you, a roving or a single ply, which I showed you, a plied yarn, and then you can also have a blown yarn, which has actually become quite popular recently. And that is like for example, like drops air or drop swish or camarose snefnug. These are all yarns that are like, they have like a mesh and then fiber is blown into the mesh. So there's no ply. It's like a tube that holds the fiber. And I don't have an example here to show you, but you can look it up and I'll put a picture on the screen here for you to see. A blown yarn is a tube with fiber blown inside. So those are your different constructions of yarn. You've got weight, you've got fiber construction. The other thing to think about when you are choosing a yarn to use for your project is the gauge. So going back to our example, the gingerbread sweater from SUBSTITUTIONS is knit at a 21 stitch gauge. And when I'm talking about gauge and stitch gauge, it's usually the number of stitches that are in your worked final fabric over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So for example, this is a sweater. This is the sweater number 11 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. This, I believe, has a 16 stitch gauge, which means if you held it up and counted 16 columns of stitches, that would get you 4 inches. It might be more than that, but generally that's what gauge means. Here's a sock. The number of stitches in your knit fabric that measure 4 inches. So I think this is, I don't know, I didn't use a pattern for this, so not the best example, but if you measured 4 inches, you would probably have like 20 stitches for 4 inches. that's what you are looking for when you're doing a gauge swatch, but it's also helpful when you're buying yarn because most yarns that come with tags tell you what gauge they should be knit at. So this is a skein of Pearl Soho's linen quill. This is a fingering weight yarn that's about 415 meters per 100 grams. On the tag, it tells you that this yarn works for gauges from 26 to 30 stitches over your 4 inches, and they even give you yarn or needle size recommendations. So the gauge on this will tell you, okay, so you could look at this yarn and think anything that has a 26 to a 30 stitch gauge, I can probably use this yarn for. This is the Retrosaria Baroa. This has a recommended gauge of 18 to 20 stitches. This is Drops Paris, which is like a worsted weight yarn, and it has a gauge of it has a recommended gauge of 17 stitches. This is a fingering weight yarn from Snefnug Sisu. It has a 27 stitch recommended gauge. So that's another way to kind of tell. So if I'm looking at this pattern and it's telling me I need 21 stitches for gauge, I can look for a yarn that has a similar gauge to that. So when you're shopping for yarn, the things that you want to look for are the weight of the yarn, the spin of the yarn, and the gauge that your project is knit at, and the recommended gauge for your yarn. There's always some wiggle room. You can probably knit, so this yarn recommends 18 to 20 stitches. I could probably knit it a little bit denser and get 21 stitches to match the gauge of the pattern. There's some wiggle room, but generally, another rule of thumb to think about is if you're knitting anything from like a 24 stitch gauge or larger, so like 24, 26, 28, 30 stitches over your gauge swatch, that's something you can use like a lace weight or a fingering weight or even a sport weight for. Anything that's like 20 stitches to 22 stitches, that's where you can use like a sport or a DK. Sometimes you can squeeze it out of a worsted. Anything that's like 19, 18, 17, 16, that's kind of like your worsted territory. And any gauge that's 15, 14, 13, 12, 10 stitches per 10 centimeters, that's more in your bulky territory. I will put some like infographics here so you know what the heck I'm talking about, because I'm not sure I'm making it super clear. But yes, so when you're shopping for a yarn substitution for a project, you want to think gauge, you want to think spin, you want to think weight. You also want to think fiber, but that's kind of like a completely different story and another video in and of itself. But generally, you should like try to substitute fibers 1 for 1. So if the yarn is like 100% wool, it's very safe to substitute another 100% wool yarn for that. If it's a 50-50 wool and alpaca, like something that's like 60-40, something around that, similar substitution. I've made substitutions before that were completely different, and my products, I had to make adjustments. So for right now, for simplicity's sake, we're just going to talk about yarn construction and not fiber, but if you want me to talk more about fiber, I'm happy to do that in another video. It's kind of a lot, but yes. So I'm not sure that really made any sense, but generally when you're trying to pick out a yarn, you want something that's a similar weight, a similar gauge, and a similar spin to the yarn that's recommended in the pattern. There are really great tools out there for you to find yarns that are like that. So if you like, the yarn recommended in this pattern is the Knitting for Olive Merino and the Camarose Midnatssol yarn, which is a fingering weight merino yarn and a lace weight alpaca silk yarn. So if I wanted to do that for this, I would look for other fingering weight 100% merino or 100% wool yarns. The Knitting for Olive Merino has 250 meters per 50 grams, so that's 500 meters per 100 grams. So I would want to look for a 100% wool yarn that is fingering weight, so that like something like this could probably work. This is a 100% wool, 100% merino fingering weight yarn. It doesn't have to be perfect, like they don't have to line up perfectly, but they should be similar. You just need, if you're going to do a swap like that, you just need to be cognizant of the amount of meterage that the pattern calls for and the amount of meterage that you have in your yarn, and make sure you're buying enough appropriately. So I would probably need to buy 1 or 2 more balls than are recommended here because this yarn has slightly lower meterage, but your mileage may vary. And then if I'm looking for an alternative to the lace weight alpaca yarn that's held in here, I could look for another fuzzy yarn that's lace weight. So like a lace weight mohair silk or a brushed cashmere, something like that, that's similar construction, similar idea, different yarn. there are some resources out there that can help you get started if you're trying to figure out what substitutions there are, because there are so many different kinds of yarn in the world, especially if you don't have a huge stash at home and you're going out to the yarn store to buy yarn for your next project. It's nice to know what you've got. So a great place to look for yarn options is yarnsub.com. So if I wanted to look for maybe a more affordable alternative to the Knitting for Olive Merino, I can go to yarnsub.com. It's really wonderful. And you can put Knitting for Olive Merino in the search engine, and it will pull up a ton of options that are similar in construction, similar in fiber content, and similar in gauge to the Knitting for Olive Merino. And it gives me a ton of examples, all sorts of things you can choose from. It's a great place to start if you want to start looking for options. You could do the same thing for the camarose. Another thing that I think is really helpful is to go on Ravelry and look at the project that you want to make, and go to the projects tab and look through all the projects on there and see what other people have used. And if their gauge was similar, and look at people's projects. Lots of people do a great job recording their projects in Ravelry and telling you what yarn they used, what needle size they used, what size they made in the pattern, what gauge they got, and you can kind of see how other people's experience has gone and then base your yarn judgment. So if you see like a really beautiful version that someone made on Ravelry, you can just use the same yarn that they used. Or you go to Yarn Sub and look for a sub for that yarn and like try and figure out what's going to work for you. So those are two great options for trying to find yarn. You can also just go into your local yarn store and ask someone and say, hey, this is the pattern I'm looking to make. These are the yarns that it's suggesting I use. Do you have anything similar? Do you have any recommendations? Do you have anything you think would work better for this? Local yarn stores are amazing, and the people that work there are wonderful resources to help you. Okay. So I hope that was coherent. Basically, when you're trying to substitute a yarn, you want to make sure that you have a similar weight, a similar gauge, similar yarn construction. Now, the other thing I do want to talk about is substituting out mohair, because there are a lot of patterns that are written for a fingering weight yarn and a mohair held together, or a DK weight yarn and a mohair held together. And I know personally that that can be really, I don't always love, there are a couple reasons why I don't always follow that instruction. One, because I find mohair quite expensive, and it really raises the price of your project to be having to hold two yarns together. And the second thing is that I don't want all my sweaters to be fuzzy and have mohair in them. I love a good fuzzy mohair sweater, but I don't want all my sweaters to have mohair in them. So, for example, this sweater that we're looking at, the gingerbread sweater by Espace Tricot, recommends holding a fingering weight and a mohair together. But if you go to the stitch gauge for this project, it says 21 stitches. So if I think back, I could probably use a DK weight yarn held on its own, just one strand of DK weight yarn, and get a similar gauge, or a one strand of sport weight yarn, or one strand of worsted yarn, and probably get a similar gauge to what I have here. So instead of having to buy a sweater's quantity of fingering weight yarn and a sweater's quantity of mohair to hold together, I could buy one sweater's quantity of DK weight yarn based on the gauge that's in the pattern, and do a swatch and then see if that yarn will work for me. And that way you don't have to hold mohair with everything, because there are so many beautiful sweaters, but so many people that don't love mohair, either because they don't like the look of it or they don't like the feel of it, and there are ways to work around that. I've made many, many, many patterns that call for mohair and omitted the mohair, and you still get a beautiful result. You have to be aware that it's not going to probably look exactly like the sample, but it's an option if you either find it uncomfortable or you're allergic to it or it's expensive. There are alternatives for you to make like a beautiful sweater from Petite Knit or My Favorite Things Knitwear or any number of designers that love to use mohair. You don't have to use mohair to get a similar structure in your sweater. So that was the other one thing I wanted to mention. Okay, I did have a couple comments I put like a comment or a suggestion box, a question box on my Instagram, which if you'd like to follow me, my handle is apt.atelier. And that's where I post pictures of my knitting and talk about knitting on Instagram. So if you'd like to follow me, you can do so there. But a couple people left me some questions about yarn. So I will answer those while we wrap this up. Let me just make sure I'm addressing all the questions that I got. Okay, great. So the first one that I got was about substitutes for nutiden. Nutiden is an unspun yarn. It's extremely popular right now. It's also kind of difficult to get. It comes from a small yarn producer in Sweden. They update their shop like once a month. They open it early to patrons on their Patreon, But if you're not a patron on their Patreon, it can be really difficult to get, and it can be cost prohibitive if you're shipping it, especially to the United States. The shipping is quite expensive. Like, I looked one time to buy some nutiden, and it was like $20 a ball for 100 grams of yarn, but then it was going to be like another $20 to $25 to ship it to me, which is just a little bit cost prohibitive. So if you, like me, are based in the US and are looking for alternatives to nutiden, or if you're not based in the US but you are looking for alternatives to nutiden because you just can't get your hands on it or it's too expensive for you, there are a lot of really great other unspun options. Unspun yarn has been growing in popularity recently for a lot of good reasons. I really, really enjoy working with unspun yarn, and there are other options on the market besides nutiden. So the standard kind of classic unspun yarn that's been available for years is plotulopi by Istex, which is the same company that makes letlopi. It's available in tons of colors. It's generally pretty available in the US at yarn stores. You can order them online directly from Iceland for fairly affordably, but it is like they sell it on yarn.com and Lovecrafts, and there are accessible places to buy it in the US. The thing about plotulopi that I think people don't like is that it is a long-haired sheep, so there are lots of yarn, long hairs, as you can kind of see with the letlopi. It's a fuzzier yarn, and it's not a soft fuzz. It can be a bit prickly. So, but I think that prickliness makes it really strong. So if it's your first time knitting with unspun yarn, I would recommend starting with plotulopi because it's not too big of a jump from knitting with like a normal plied yarn to knitting with plotulopi. It's pretty robust. It doesn't fall apart very easily. So you could use it for like a pair of mittens or a scarf or something that you're not going to wear next to your skin. Would be a great place to start practicing. It's really affordable. It's $10 a plate, generally is the standard price in the US. And one plate, if you hold it single, is 300 meters, which is a sport weight yarn or a fingering weight yarn. Kind of, it's in that general weight. And you can hold 2 strands together to get like a DK worsted gauge. So it's very versatile. It's pretty readily available. It's very affordable. But just be aware that if you're sensitive, it may not be something that you want to wear next to your skin. I've knit with plotulopi and worn it next to my skin before, and I don't have a problem, but to each their own on that. Plotulopi is probably the most affordable and most readily available alternative to nutiden. There are quite a few other options out there that you may have to hunt for a little bit, but are also good options. I haven't used all of these, but I have seen them and considered purchasing them because I do love a good unspun yarn. So one option that is kind of more recently emerged on the market is machelopis, which is from Spain. Ozetta, if you're familiar with her patterns, really, really likes machelopis. Her Miles shirt jacket and her Dina's bag are knit with machelopi. From what I've touched it before, they have it at my local yarn store, and it's very soft. So I think if you're looking for something that is not quite as scratchy as plotulopi, that's a good option. It runs, I think generally if you're buying it in the US from a US supplier, it's like $18 a ball. You can buy it from Europe and have it shipped for less. Or if you live in Europe, it's a little bit more affordable there. But it's a similar price point to nutiden. They do have a good variety of colors. They have like natural sheep colors and then some lighter pastel colors. I think they have a blue and a pink and a green. So not a huge color selection, but it's really soft and it's really beautiful. And I think it comes with 2 strands plied together in the ball. So that's a great way to knit with that. Another option, which is harder to get if you're in the US, is hillesvag. Hillesvag, which is a Norwegian yarn producer. It's sold pretty available. It's sold in Norway. There's a yarn store in Canada that carries hillesvag's unspun yarn. It's called Wet Coast Wools. It's in Vancouver, BC, and they do ship. So I will link their website down below if you're interested in looking into that. It's about $24 Canadian per cake. Woollentwine Fiber Studio, which is a small hand-dyed yarn studio based in Germany, sells an unspun yarn. Briggs & Little, which is a Canadian company, sells an unspun yarn. It's their country roving. It comes in 200-gram cakes, and it comes 5 strands together. I have used that yarn before, and I used it single ply. I just had to take the time to kind of separate the strands of yarn, which it's delicate, but definitely worth it. If it's very cost effective. I think it's like $12. I just ordered some. It's like $12.50 US for 200 grams, which is a really good price. And I like the Briggs & Little because it is robust like the plotulopi, but softer than plotulopi. So I would say it sits between plotulopi and the machelopis or the hillesvag. It's more robust. It's not going to fall apart as easily. So that's another great alternative. If you are super sensitive to itch, but you want to try an unspun yarn, you could try the Briggs & Little, which you can buy in Canada or you can buy in the US from some local yarn stores, or also from Maritime Family Fiber, which is the store that I ordered mine from. It's the Briggs & Little US distributor. So that's an option. Ullcentrum, which is another Swedish company, has an unspun yarn. Those are all the options that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more. And I will leave all this in the notes down below for you if you're looking for alternatives. But I love unspun yarn, and I'm always on the hunt for more good dupes. So if you know any other ones, leave them in the comments down below. And if you're looking for alternative to nutiden, those are good places to start. Someone else asked for alternatives to blown yarns, which I think is fair because blown yarn is also quite popular. It's nice because it's really lightweight, but like bouncy. So I would say a standard ball of a blown yarn like Drops Air or a camarose snefnug has like 150 meters to 50 grams, which is the meterage of like a sport weight yarn, but the yarn itself, it can be deceiving because it has the thickness of like a worsted weight yarn. So that's why it's important to not only check the meterage of the yarn you're buying, but also the recommended gauge. I have made this mistake before, and it's not hard to correct for, but you just need to be aware of it. So alternatives to blown yarn, you've got your Drops Air, your Drops Wish, camarose snefnug. They have like the dyed one and the natural colored one. Isager, alpaca soft, or ecosoft is one. Barocco Mochi is another option. Wool and the Gang has their Feelin' Good yarn, which is a blown yarn. Knit Picks Wonder Fluff is a blown yarn. Gepard Garn Puno. If you put blown yarns into Yarn Sub, it will give you a huge list. So blown yarn substitutes I think are becoming more and more easy to find. The most affordable ones are going to be the Drops yarn, which if you're based in the US, you're going to have to order from the UK. Wool Warehouse is a great place to order from, or Purple Sheep yarns in the UK. But there's Knit Picks and Barocco if you're looking for some more US-based options. Blown yarn can be kind of expensive is the only thing that's a little bit annoying, and you need a lot of it to make a lot of the patterns that are knit with it. So Drops is probably the most affordable option that I've found for blown yarns. I got another question about alternatives to mohair yarns. So I talked earlier about omitting mohair, but if you want to knit two-stranded and get a similar fluffy effect to mohair, you can use Surrey alpaca, which is like a brushed alpaca, or just kind of any lace weight alpaca. Drops has a lace weight alpaca. There are lots of indie dyers that dye on Surrey alpaca bases. I will leave a video linked down below by Caroline's Knits, who is a knitting content creator based in the UK. She did an entire video about mohair substitutes, and it's really incredible and very thorough. So I'll link that if you're looking for a resource. Caroline did a great job on that video. You could also just use like a lace weight alpaca. So something like Holst titcaca or isager alpaca 1. They're not brushed, so they're not fluffy, but they will give your project that like softness and drape that you're looking for if you're holding it together with a lace weight yarn. So yeah, those are the mohair alternatives I can think of off the top of my head. Like the one in this pattern, the gingerbread, the camarose midnatssol. It's pretty affordable lace weight brushed alpaca. Drops has one, and there are others that I can't think of off the top of my head, but there are many, many options. Someone else asked me for substitutes for Knitting for Olive or Rauma. Those are kind of very different yarns, I would say, but good. So the Knitting for Olive merino, which is their fingering weight merino that I talked about a little bit earlier, is a very fine yarn, but it's a 100% merino fingering weight yarn. There are so many options that are similar to that. If you go into any yarn store, go to yarnsub.com and it will tell you like so many natural or indie dyers dye on 100% merino fingering weight. Like Sendness Garn Sunday is a 100% yarn, 100% merino fingering weight yarn you could use. I think that there's like, if you want more of an American yarn, Cascade has a Cascade 220 fingering is a 100% wool fingering weight yarn. Filcolana has 100% wool fingering weight yarns. Most Knit Picks Palette is a 100% wool fingering weight yarn. There are so many options. So I would say if you're looking explicitly for something that's very similar to that, go on YarnSub and look, or look at patterns on Ravelry that are where knitting for olive merino is a recommended yarn and see what other people have used. So that's again when you can go to the Ravelry projects page. I know that My Favorite Things Knitwear uses a lot of knitting for olive merino, so any of her patterns would probably be a good place to look. Go to one of her patterns that uses that as a recommended yarn and then look at people's projects and see what they've used. As for the Rauma, which I think if you're talking about Rauma, you're probably asking about the Finul garn, which is a like fingering to sport weight, more rustic yarn that's really good for color work. Some alternatives to that I can think of off the top of my head are like Jamieson's and Smith, Jamieson's of Shetland, Holst garn, super soft, hillesvag, Solje or Ask, Drops, Flora, I would say. I mean, I have a ball of it right here. It's 100%, it's a 65-35 wool and alpaca blend, but it's fingering weight, and I think it would be good for color work, which is generally what Rauma is used for. You could use Tuca wool fingering. So sorry, we're just very rudely interrupted by my camera battery dying. But anyway, back to what I was saying. We're talking about alternatives to Rauma Finul. Sadness Garn just came out with a tin Peer Gynt, which is a 100% merino wool. I think the original Peer Gynt was like a DK or a worsted, and the tin Peer Gynt is a fingering weight yarn. So if you live somewhere where Sadness Garn is accessible, there are quite a few American yarn stores that carry it, or you can order it online from Mother Knitter, which is the US distributor for Sadness Garn. Let me think. I said Tuca wool. Geez, there are so many fingering weight yarns in the world. It's probably, I would say fingering weight, DK, and worsted are the easiest yarns to find. Most yarn stores carry them in abundance. Brooklyn Tweed has a fingering weight yarn that would be good for color work. There are so many. Again, go to Yarn Sub and see what's there. Go to the Ravelry projects page of any project that recommends Rauma Finul, see what's there. Go to your local yarn store and ask just like, what's a great alternative to this yarn for color work, or just like a more rustic 100% wool fingering to sport weight yarn. So yes, I hope that answers your questions. I hope those resources were helpful to you. I hope this was clear and understandable in any way, shape, or form. But obviously I love yarn. I love talking about yarn, and I love helping people find more affordable or accessible ways to knit. So if you have any questions about yarn substitutions down below and you're just like, don't know where to start, I'm happy to troubleshoot those for you, and we can work through it in the comments, or you can send me a message on Instagram. Again, this is my handle. You can find me there. I'm actually better at answering comments than I am about answering messages on Instagram, so comments are probably better, but if you'd like to have more of a conversation and it's easier for you, we can do that on Instagram. But I want to help you knit more. So if you need help finding the right yarn for your next project, or you have any questions about yarns that I've used in the past, or any of the yarns that I showed here today, my experience using them, please let me know. I'm happy to chat about it with you. And just remember, when you're looking for yarns, you got to think about the weight, you got to think about the gauge, you got to think about the construction. And yeah, happy knitting, friends. I hope you have a lovely day. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. If you're new here, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up. It's great to have you. I love talking with you all about yarn. I love chatting with you in the comments of my videos. So let's keep this good thing going, and I will see you in a couple weeks with my next video.